Scripture this morning is from Exodus 16, verses 2 to 15. There in the desert, they all complained to Moses and Aaron and said to them, "We wish that the Lord had killed us in Egypt. There we could at least sit down and eat meat and as much food as we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve us all to death." The Lord said to Moses, "Now I am going to cause food to rain down from the sky for all of you. The people must go out every day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I can test them to find out if they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to bring in twice as much as usual and prepare it." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "This evening, you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. In the morning, you will see the dazzling light of the Lord's presence. He has heard your complaints against him. Yes, against him, because we are only carrying out his instructions." Then Moses said, "It is the Lord who will give you meat to eat in the evening, and as much bread as you want in the morning, because he has heard how much you have complained against him. When you complained against us, you are really complaining against the Lord." Moses said to Aaron, "Tell the whole community to come and stand before the Lord, because he has heard their complaints." As Aaron spoke to the whole community, they turned towards the desert, and suddenly the dazzling light of the Lord appeared in a cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them that at twilight they will have meat to eat, and in the morning they will have all the bread they want. Then they will know that I, the Lord, am their God." In the evening, a large flock of quail flew in, enough to cover the camp. And in the morning, there was dew all around the camp. When the dew evaporated, there was something thin and flaky on the surface of the desert. It was as delicate as frost. When the Israelites saw it, they didn't know what it was and asked each other, "What is it?" Moses said to them, "This is the food that the Lord has given you to eat. The Lord has commanded that each of you is to gather as much of it as he needs, 2 quarts for each member of his household." Thanks be to God.
As you probably noticed last week, I talk about my dog a lot, Yoda, who turns out to be not as wise, though he does have big ears, as the actual Yoda. Yoda, I talk about Yoda a lot because Yoda's wonderful, and that's great. Except there was this one thing I mentioned last week that I'd just like to mention again that you probably at the time thought that's too much information. Yoda eats anything that's on the ground. Doesn't matter what it is, he'll try and eat it. That could mean it's something that's edible, like if you drop some food or something, he's like a little vacuum cleaner, he'll clean that up for you. But it does mean he'll eat other things. This is about to turn into something quite catastrophic because for reasons that are completely beyond my comprehension, Lori's decided to have another dog, and it's a puppy that is not trained. Yes. So that whole eats anything on the floor thing's about to get worse. But the thing about that is that Yoda is not the least bit discerning about what's on the ground. He doesn't care. He'll put it in his mouth. I know some of you are probably thinking, you might have had children like that, but still, he'll actually try, he won't give up. He'll actually try and eat it. And he's just not even remotely discerning. I, on the other hand, I'd just like to say, it has been said that I am picky or fussy because there are certain food items that I do not care for. I think that was a really politically good way of saying that. Okay. Raisins, for example, I don't eat raisins because raisins are just grapes that somebody belittled until they shriveled up from a lack of confidence, and I don't think that's good. I don't eat beets because beets are just a turnip that somebody beat up until it turned red. Cauliflower, it's really, really pale broccoli. It didn't even have the guts to turn green. Why would you eat that? The thing is, there's absolutely certain things that I don't like to eat. It's not like I can't eat them, as far as I know, but I just don't like to eat them. And I have good reasons. Those are all good reasons, aren't they? They're ridiculous, aren't they? And there's the problem with the whole discerning thing. See, I want to say I'm not picky or fussy, I'm discerning. I am. I'm not just going to pick something up off the ground and eat it, unless it was something I dropped there a few moments ago. But still, you don't do that. And I'm just discerning. Aren't you? The problem with that is, what do you discern? How are you discerning? What are you discerning? What's your criteria for discerning? If your criteria for I don't eat raisins is they're just grapes that somebody belittled until they shriveled up from a lack of confidence, that may well be entertaining, but not even remotely possible, as far as we know. I mean, I've never actually talked to a grape, so I don't know that for sure. But that's the thing about being discerning. Everyone's criteria is different. So what is your criteria? Is it there's a big trend now there are markets that sell food that wouldn't be normally sold in a store, like fruit and vegetables, because they don't look like they have to look in order to get into a supermarket. Right? They don't look like an apple is supposed to look. They might be lumpy or the wrong shape or things like that. And there's a big trend now because there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a question of appearance. There's nothing wrong with it. And I can guarantee you, if you put that on the floor, Yoda would eat it. Or try to. What's our criteria for being discerning about things? Because that ought to be a huge issue in this story. I'm not eating that. It's on the ground. I don't know where it came from. Not to mention a quail. Have you ever had quail? Has anyone ever eaten quail? It's probably like really tiny chicken, I guess. I don't know. I've never had it. But here's an interesting thing about that story, too, by the way. Those are both things that actually occur. There's actually a theory about this, that there's quail everywhere. There was quail on the screen a few moments ago. It's changed now, but there'll be more quail on the screen. There's quail on your bulletin because quail get a bad rap, I'm telling you right now. They get a bad rap. Whenever you retell this story of God feeding the Israelites in the wilderness, it's always, there was manna from heaven. Where's the quail? Nobody ever mentions the quail. There was quail. There's quail everywhere. I mean, it's a common bird. It's everywhere. So the fact that quail would descend on the camp at night, of course they would. They're everywhere. And the next morning, there's apparently some desert plant that overnight secretes some sort of thing, and then in the morning, with the dew and stuff, it actually produces this white flaky substance. It's a real thing. Did you know that? It's a real thing. God only knows why you'd eat it. Oh, wait. There you go. See, here's the thing about that story is however you tell that story, whether it was a miracle that God made stuff just miraculously appear out of nowhere, or whether you tell it as God pointed out something that was there. It's all about God leading us to it, isn't it? It's there, go and eat it. I'm not eating that. I was just walking on it yesterday. So it's a little different, and it doesn't look like what you would normally eat, but try it anyway. And here's an interesting thing. In the next chapter of Exodus, it actually says that they lived on this stuff for 40 years. That is some highly nutritional stuff secreted by a plant that grows in the desert. Not to mention quail. I'm surprised we even eat chicken. Why don't we eat quail? Because obviously you can live on it for 40 years. The thing is, whether they actually did live on it for 40 years or not, it was what they needed in the moment. It was nutrition. It was what kept them alive. It fed them. The whole congregation of the Israelites, it fed them. So, let's go back to discerning. They even ask, right, towards the end of that passage that we heard. The stuff appears, Moses says, here, go and harvest it. And what's the first thing they do? Go and harvest? No, it's not. The first thing they do is, what is it? So how do you hear that? You just heard that the Israelites were complaining in the desert. In fact, we repeatedly hear they're complaining. So of course, we probably hear that as, what is it? Or is it, wow, what is that? That's cool. Whatever it is, somebody pointed it out, and then pointed out you can eat it. And in fact, it can keep you alive. You're going to eat it. I don't know if you're somebody who spends a lot of time out in the wilderness. I am not. But if you spend a lot of time out in the middle of nowhere, it behooves you to know what you can eat and what you can't. Because otherwise you'd probably eat something that kills you. But it also, if you spend a lot of time out there, it behooves you to know what's good for you and what's not. What will not only keep you alive, but will provide you with enough nutrition to go forward. And here's where they are. We're hungry. Here's something for you to eat and move you forward. So what is it? And that's the thing about being discerning, is that it's more than what is it. And just think about how many years, centuries even, we've listened to people tell us things, and we've just believed it without being particularly discerning about it. You could be listening to me this morning and going, oh, that must be right. That business about the stuff in the desert, the plant that secretes the thing. Look it up. Please look it up. Please don't listen to me tell you and then go, oh, that must be right. Look it up. Find out. That's the thing about being discerning, is what is the criteria for things that nourish us, for things that are good for us, for the things that move us forward. Let's actually not even say, oh, it's good for you. Let's say the things that feed us enough to move us forward, the things that give us strength, the things that give us life. What's the criteria for that? Anybody? Criteria? Anybody? Got any thoughts on? We don't really even think about it, do we? We don't. Sometimes I do. It's Lori's celiac, so I read packages all the time on food because I want to see whether there's wheat in it or gluten in it. All the time. Lori never reads the packages. I want to find out. I want to know. Because I want to know that it's safe. I want to know that it's... But we're not always like that. And when you do read the label or think about what somebody just told you, what's your criteria for finding out about it? And please don't just go on the internet and look at Wikipedia, because other people wrote that. They could be making it up too. Be discerning about things, right? When somebody tells you that this is what God intends for you, do you receive that as okay, or do you go, what is it? Do you wonder about it? Do you think about it? Do you think, well, okay, but does that actually fit in with what I also read over here in the Bible or over here in the Bible? Or when Jesus said this, how do those two things go together? You should. You absolutely should. Don't listen to me stand here and tell you about how you should love your neighbor. Think about why you should love your neighbor. Think about all of the things that go into loving your neighbor. Think about your neighbor. Who is your neighbor? Think about who you might not want to have as your neighbor, because that's the person you need to love the most. What? Yes. See, here's the Israelites in Egypt. They're about to leaving Egypt. They're in the wilderness now. They've so far complained that they were going to be killed by the Egyptians. God saved them. They've complained about not having food. God saved them. Next week they're going to complain, by the way, about water, and they're going to get water. But they're going forward into the wilderness. And if you read the rest of Exodus, that whole time in the wilderness is a time of learning about each other, about themselves, about relationships, about how to be together. You could interpret the 10 Commandments as, here are 10 things God demands that you do, or you could interpret the 10 Commandments as, here's 10 really good and important fundamental things about how we live together. And we must live together. We're built to congregate. That sounded so much better in my head. Now it just sounds weird. We are built for community. See, we use that congregation word like it means this, right? It's a church thing. It's a church word. No, it's not. We congregate everywhere all the time. We assemble as the congregation here for what purpose? Why are you here? We come together because first of all, we might find a sense of belonging. We learn together. We do things together that we have in common, but we might also then congregate for the things that challenge us, because we're built for that. We as human beings are built for that. We need each other. We grow in community. God didn't lead the Israelites out into the wilderness and go, hey, do what you want, go where you want. It was, let's go together. And let's go forward together. And as we're going forward together, here's some ways that we can learn about each other. Here's some ways that we can learn how important it is to help each other. Here's some ways that we can learn how important it is to care for each other and feed each other. Here's some really important ways that we can learn to actually think about each other and what we mean to each other. I've always found it really curious that in this story, and it may seem like an entirely insignificant thing, but in this story, when the manna appears, the first thing the Israelites do isn't, oh, yummy, let's eat that. It's ask what it is. They didn't ask about the quail because they knew what that was. But they asked about the other thing because they didn't. They didn't simply accept, here, eat it. What is it? It's the food that God gives you to eat. Well, over the next 40 years, they're going to discover that the food that nourishes, that sustains, that gives us growth is each other. Relationships. Building community with each other. These are the things that cause us to grow. And if you want to be discerning about what those things might be, here's a few things that we might start with. Is there love? Is anyone being hurt by it? Does it bring growth? Does it feed and nourish? That ought to be the basic criteria for things. Things like, I don't know, but it looks delicious, ought to be right at the bottom of the list. They ought to be. You know they're not, but they ought to be. Just because it looks good doesn't mean it's a good thing. There's more to it. It needs to be filling and fulfilling as well. We need to be truly discerning about how we live with each other. But the criteria for that ought to be based on these fundamental things that, like the Israelites learned in the desert. these things like loving God and loving each other. And when you think about loving God, how do you think of God? Because if God to you is love, then you are simply loving to love. How could that be a bad thing? Caring for each other, respecting each other. That ought to be the criteria by which we find life delicious. Please don't just randomly eat what's ever on the floor.